Yo, I'm Soycat, and humans will settle basically anywhere on planet Earth that there's land, but despite that, there are only 10,000 settlements that have a population above 100,000. But not all cities are created equally, as there are 9 cities that will always come up a significant amount more in culture, but also have a hugely outsized impact on the world's financial, business, and legal markets. And why is that the case? Why are there 9 Alpha Plus or Alpha Plus Plus cities, and what is it that divides these two categories from each other, and indeed from the rest of the world? The most logical guesses as to why GAWC might have come up with this is like, well, obviously it's got to be something like, like a geographic distribution or wealth of cities or population, but I'm going to show you how none of these things are perfectly true, and instead there is something much deeper at play, which can hopefully help you understand why there are some countries that are hugely important, but that don't have a city on this list, and why countries that are otherwise not that important manage to get one too. With that said, let's dive into the first thing, which is to say there are technically a category below this, which is Alpha, and if we include those cities on the list, you'll see that geographic distribution, even with those included, is not even around the world. There is a hugely disproportionate number of cities that are Alpha or Alpha Plus Plus ranked inside of Europe, as you can see right here, but also you can see in East Asia there is a similar thing, and then the same is true for the east coast of North America. And then you can see that Africa in particular is very much lacking outside of Johannesburg, and that you can see the same with Sao Paulo being the only major city in South America. There is a very, very big problem with the world not having an even geographic spread, but that's also true for wealth, right? So like, oh, Toycat, I see what you've done here. You've assumed that it's going to be based on population or geography, when actually the language that cities speak is money. But if we try to look at the most expensive cities in the world, because a lot of people would argue, well, if they have the most money, they'd be the most expensive, the Alpha Plus and Alpha Plus Plus cities don't perfectly line up with the most expensive cities in the world. Here's a top 10, and as you can see, Copenhagen and Seoul and Osaka do not make the Alpha Plus cities list, despite being incredibly expensive. That's because there are other factors that lead to a city becoming expensive. By the way, if you think that seeing 1 to 10 makes it, if you think 1 to 10 is like, oh yeah, 10 must be so cheap, if you actually do it in terms of worldwide cost of living index, Singapore is about 20% more expensive than New York, but it's only 20% more expensive. All of these cities are hugely expensive, but again, not every single expensive city is a world city, and so, oh, it's going to be based on the actual wealth being produced there. This is the Global Cities Index, and it's produced by a firm, it's by Oxford Economics, where they basically claim to try and work out how much of an impact on the world economy do these places have. It goes very broad with that analysis, but as you can see, although there is a huge centering inside of Europe for these cities, something that might surprise you if you think about the way that the world is now, you can see that this is what explains a lot of European cities. But why is it then that most East Asian cities that are a hugely important global city have managed to go into the Alpha category, while the European cities basically haven't outside of Paris and London? This is something that you could also ask with North America. There are lots of big North American cities that are hugely economic important to their regions, but not to the world. What is it that makes a city global, that makes it one that you could question being the capital of the world? Well, I feel like we could use population as the easy next metric. Like, well, yeah, anyone who explains why they have to have a headquarters in London, why they have to, because, if you think about it, even if, even if people say that, like, you'll never have someone who says that despite the huge population in, say, Kenya, you never have an office in Kenya. You might have, manufacturing done in Shanghai, or a huge engineering headquarters in San Jose, or whatever the case may be, but the truth is that you're rarely going to have a big place outside of one of these cities. But so why is it that these have the huge advantage? Well, economics seems like it is a part. There is a correlation here, much stronger than before. Population seems like it has a very light correlation. You can see Tokyo and New York City are both Alpha Plus cities, or Alpha Plus Plus in the case of New York, but all of the other cities don't make the top 20 in the world. I've made this lovely bar chart right here, hopefully proves that to you, that the world's largest city in 2050, but even the world's, top 20 in today, it's still not got, none of the Indian cities on this list, and none of the African cities on this list are considered either world cities or to be Alpha Plus cities. So is population not the metric that matters? Yeah, I would argue it's not. I would argue that even the number of cities you have in a country is not a positive correlation. China is the only country which has a ridiculous number of cities, and then then also a ridiculous number of world cities. You can see how that really, if we come back here, like, oh yeah, they get 2.5, depending on how you want to measure that. But having 2.5 cities is the most of any country, and so just having so many cities increases your odds, maybe you could say at a stretch. But I think that, yeah, the actual way that we can look at this is to say, no. It's not the number of cities you have. It's not how big the population is. What seems to matter much more for making a global city is the economics of it, which is, like sort of true. But there's also something much more important than the current economic standing, and that is basically the prior one. Something that a lot of people fail to realize about something that makes New York and London particularly important and makes the world particularly reliant on these cities is the fact that it almost seems like smug to say this when you live in one of those places, but it is true. When you go to any Alpha Plus city, you do notice the difference in terms of the things that you expect and the services and the level of person that seems to be there. But also going a level beyond that, there is also just something about the fact that there is always references to these cities. What do these two cities actually have in common? I would say history. If we go to historic population, in 1900, these were the most populous cities in the world. We have just a top 10 for you here, but you can see that there is a Europe bias, and you can see within the rest of the Americas, I guess, there's a East Coast of the USA bias, but still, despite that fact, it's like, yeah, these were the biggest cities, and then those cities kind of turned into free in Europe. Obviously, the rest kind of moved over there, and then in North America, it turned into 2. I'm surprised that Toronto has a lower population than Chicago here, but that's a point for a different time. But yeah, as we go through here, you can see, like, yeah, these are the 2 cities, or the 3 cities, I guess, London, Paris, and New York, with Chicago and Moscow being outliers that you could probably explain by looking at their specific circumstances. I don't think I need to explain Moscow's, but Chicago is very interesting, right? But if we look at these 3, you can see, like, oh yeah, these were the most populous cities in 1950. They managed to grow past, or out of the Industrial Revolution, because to get to this point, you had to be a huge industrial city, and to get to this point, you had to be a huge industrial city that could grow into something new once the war was over, right? And that's what these cities did quite successfully. However, then that means that if we then look at 2000, you can see that even as the population moves away from these places, and in 2025 it moves away even further, by 2050 there are no Europeans, in fact actually, no, by 2010 there's no European cities, I'm gonna make that bold stance right now, that are actually the most populous 20 in the world. But despite that fact, if we go back to our original thing here, you can see there are 2 cities that are globally required for the world. And so why is it that Alpha Plus and Alpha Plus Plus cities have their rank? I would argue it is some amount down to the history. I think that in the far future, you might find that Delhi, you might find that Manila, you might find that Kinshasa actually have outsized impact on the world. Like, I would actually say not Kinshasa, no offense, but probably Lagos might actually have a huge impact on the world, and the same is true for Mexico City, you could argue. But having a high population and having a high economic output are just 2 parts of the equation. The third is actually having that history behind you. My grand point that I would like to make today, if we can do so, is the fact that having a city with 5 million people is probably a requirement. Having a decent standard of living in that country is going to be important. But as we've mentioned before, when we look at our list of Alpha Plus and Alpha Plus Plus cities, there are lots of them that notably do not have, like we might be able to say the largest economies, but lots of these cities are outside of that. Not only have we skipped over Germany, which has the 4th largest economy, but we have the case of Dubai and Singapore, which are they don't even make the top 5 there, or top 6 if we include France. So why is it the case that these cities can make it into the world rankings? And I would argue history has a huge part to play for every other city besides these 2. If you can be the world's largest city at any point in time, or even one of the world's cities for contention for it, you have this huge benefit over the world, which is that you are already big. And once you're huge in an industry, in the same way that I guess you could say McDonald's took over the fast food industry, right? But selling fast food is only profitable to a certain point, because to sell more, to make more money, you have to either increase prices, but to actually increase economic output, which is the thing that cities want to do, you need to produce more fries or produce more burgers, and there's a finite amount of burgers or fries that you can ever actually create. But all of these cities, or the ones that made it into Alpha Plus status, have realized that producing doing things is important, yes, and politicians will always sell you on the virtues of that, but the only, unlike producing things which can only produce finite economic growth, there are some services which seemingly produce infinite economic growth, because you're effectively shoveling words and money around and producing services for each other, and these services are one of the most important things for every world economy. Even economies you think are based in manufacturing have huge amounts of services, and the services in particular that are important are the ones of finance, of legal, and of anything to do with business, right? If you have any legal laws, things that you need to do, you'll probably have your contract based in one of the major cities of the world, and they can use their size as a way to be like, yeah, if you want to sign a contract, London in particular is a huge thing for that. We use a very decent law system here that is going to be globally recognized, and yeah, if you want to just like store your money here, we're a safe bet. You don't know what's going to happen in your country, so just store your money in London. It's a very popular way to get legal professionals here, but the same is true for accounting and for certain personal finance, and every other city around the world has a similar story of how you can take a huge manufacturing advantage, which New York, London, Paris, etc. had, and then you can turn that into an advantage in the legal field, in the accounting field. You know, if you want to have your accounting done somewhere, you want it to be in a major city where the best accountants in the world are. Having a lot of people allows for lots of money and ideas and things to circulate. That's why you need to have a high population to have the bougie bakeries, and a high income too, maybe. But if you want to have the cities that are important to the world, if you want to create those Alpha Plus cities, you need to have a city which at one point was huge and which has managed to turn that into a next level advantage. To go back to the McDonald's example, they don't actually make most of their business gains anymore from selling more fries each year. Selling fries is important. If they don't sell those, there's a problem. But the actual advantage that McDonald's has is that they are in the real estate game. They're in the instead of having that finite growth of selling more burgers each year and hoping that they can slowly do that, they're in the game of buying as much property as possible. They own the land and lots of their franchisees, and it means that their business can grow much, much faster than their competitors. And this is something which I think is the same for cities. If you want to be one of these world largest cities, you need to have a huge advantage in one of those fields where your gains aren't capped. Sending off your manufacturing to be done in another part of the world is a really, it seems like a bad decision on the surface, because now they're making things and we're not. But if you force them to be playing a game where they can only make a certain number of things, in other words, put it this way, if you consign yourself to only doing things which can be done by a small percent of the, or rather can only be done a certain number of times, there is a physical limit to, like screwing toothpaste caps on, or sewing clothes or something, then the cities with the highest population and the highest economic activity are going to win. But if you make some new rules to your game, and if those games just so happen to be centered in a few places, then that's how you do well. And so at this point it's worth mentioning, okay, this explains New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, and maybe to some extent Beijing and Shanghai, but what about Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai? These are small cities in otherwise kind of politically isolated places, and these all became large cities in the last century from basically nothing. If you've seen how fast these places have grown, you'll realize that you can become an Alpha Plus city. It's not just this game of maintain what you have and move into the field. It is basically, in Dubai's case, they managed to fast track their status to being a large city previously by making a lot of money, but like in the past. In the case of Singapore, they managed to do the same. They started as a very poor country, then they worked up to middle income country by refining a bunch of products for the area around them. Then they realized that being middle income forever could be great. Being a stop on the way to places is wonderful, and using their geography to their advantage can only go so far. You can only manufacture so many goods or refine so much oil, and so they moved into all of the other classic centers, being the finance center for the Asian countries around them. Basically, the same is true for Hong Kong, I think, to a lesser extent nowadays. I think it will probably be one of the first Alpha Plus cities to drop off this list. And so, yeah, if we go into the way that globalization and world cities defines it, you can see that there are two cities that stand out above all other regions. And the reason behind that, to answer the question from the intro, is that, yeah, in all analysis, London and New York stand out as clearly more integrated than other cities and constitute their own high level of integration. Other cities are always going to need to integrate into one of these two in some way, you know, you're going to have some services that are done there, except for, interestingly enough, something that is always skipped when we do this analysis is the idea of cities with sufficiency of services. These are cities that are not world cities, but have sufficient services so as not to be overtly dependent on world cities. This is the second option that you have as a country. If you can't work your way up and then past and into the kind of the stratosphere of cultural importance and of economic dependence for the regions and countries around you, then what you know, even to this day, it's worth mentioning some bizarre things that London still has a large amount of European, you know, trading of currencies and contracts going through it. But you know, despite the fact that it's outside of the union, inside of them. But yeah, it's interesting to point out that if you don't want to play that game, you can technically play the self-sufficient cities game. And so here is the list they have right here. Moscow is a really interesting example. Same with Wellington. The same is true for Durban or Bilbao in Spain, Birmingham in the UK. You get the idea. There's a lot of cities that are still economically self-sufficient and so don't require those other things. And I would say that is your second choice. You play the global game and you win, or you do very well at it, or you make a city where it doesn't matter what's going on London or Tokyo or Hong Kong. But yeah, the ultimate point of today's video is to say, have you ever wondered why when there's something which is like really cool and goes global, it jumps from London not to Madrid, it jumps from London not to you know, Berlin, but it jumps to Dubai or to Singapore or to Tokyo? And it's because these cities have almost as much traffic between these sorts of people between each other than they do of the regions around them, something which makes them all a bit of an outlier on the usual economic rule of you know, like proximity being the most important thing for trade and for prosperity. But that's a point for another time. For now, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a very different one. I hope you enjoyed the maps we made for it, and I hope that you have a great day, because I'll see you in the next one, by the way. Oh, give me money on Patreon, I meant to say here. He'll help me pay for maps and an editor or something.